Good morning, church. Before we get into the message this morning, I do want to share a couple things with you. In your pews in the racks where the Bibles or songbooks are, on the outer ones, I don't think the middle ones, but the outer ones, are some new cards that we've put out, connection cards. And these are normally for guests to fill out, so if we have guests this morning, we'd appreciate if you fill one out. But also, since we're sort of ramping things up again and renewing directories and meeting new people, if we don't have your correct information, or maybe you're somebody who's been here a long time, but you have a new phone number or something you want to update, you could use this to do that, at least this first time. So especially for guests, but if you've got to give us some new information, there's place for phone numbers, email address, and that kind of thing. And you can leave those in the pew if you want, or you can put them in the collection box, or there's a little mailbox outside Amy's office, our secretary's office, right there in the foyer. You can drop it in there, whatever is most convenient for you. We hope you'll use those to help us out a little bit. We are glad you're here today. I was going to ask you before we proceed, what were you doing in April of 1972? Interesting looks on some faces there. But in April of 1972, this congregation was celebrating a new church building. And I found this when I was rooting around in the attic here at the building one time recently, and you were hosting an open house to the community. This was in the newspaper, and on Sunday, April 23rd, 1972, from noon to 4, you welcome people to your new building. And so if you do the math, that means we've been in this facility for 50 years this year. So that's quite a milestone, and I thought you'd like to see that. If you want to see that little advertisement that was in the paper all those years ago, just ask me and I'll show it to you. Glad to be together today. In 1997, Hollywood lied to us. Now, that should not be a great shock because it often does lie to us. And in one of the most successful movies that was ever made, Titanic, there is this lie. Titanic, of course, tells a story of the tragic sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912. That tragedy claimed the lives of more than 1,500 people in the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, this movie was made, again, in 1997, and it described itself as sort of a fictionalized version of those historic events, but, and maybe they would use that as their cover for the lie that I want to tell you about, but you can sort of judge for yourself if that's sufficient cover. Many passengers that were on board the Titanic on that fateful voyage, and its inaugural voyage, actually, many of them were the wealthiest of the wealthy. Men like Benjamin Guggenheim, John Jacob Astor, and others. And so as the ship begins to sink in the movie depiction, it shows many of these wealthy men scrambling past the women and the children into the few available lifeboats in order to save themselves, and sort of leaving the weakest to fend for themselves. And also in the movie, it shows the British sailors on board the ship drawing guns and firing warning shots at those men, saying, "Women and children first." Well, that's the big lie. History tells us that nothing of that kind actually happened. There's no record of it. In fact, all of the eyewitness accounts say that all the men stood back and urged the women and children into the boats. And some of them, like John Jacob Astor, who was sort of the Bill Gates of his time, shoved his wife into one of the boats and stepped away and eventually drowned in those freezing waters. When the film came out and it began to be talked about and reviewed, the director, James Cameron, was asked why history was distorted so blatantly on this particular point, and he didn't give an answer. He sort of gave a politician's answer, but he didn't really answer the question at all. And the reviewer suggested a reason why they did it that way. And the suggestion was that if they had told the truth, no one in modern America would have believed it. Well, I certainly hope that wasn't the reason, although I don't think there's any good reason ever to tell a deliberate falsehood like Cameron did. Maybe he had an agenda against wealthy people or something like that he imposed on the film. Who knows? But what does it say about our world when many people, might consider it incredible that one person might die so another might live? It says to me that our world needs the real story of Jesus more than ever. I want us to read some verses together. Matthew chapter 27, this morning, beginning at verse 33. Matthew 27, verse 33. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he had said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Well, there's a story you can trust. Matthew tells the absolute truth about what happened. And what he says is the greatest story ever told, the most important truth ever revealed. It's something that can transform people, and it can transform communities and societies as a whole. And at the very heart of it is this truth: a person will die so another might live. One man will suffer so others don't have to. In fact, the God-man will die on a cross to save others. In fact, the truth that's recorded here in Matthew 27, it's really even greater than what we just stated. And it's sort of ironic that unknowingly it's stated by the very people, the very enemies that put the Son of God on that cross. Remember what it was that the chief priests and the scribes and the elders mockingly said of Jesus. It's in verse 42. They said, "He saved others, he cannot save himself." Now understand, when they said that, they didn't understand the truth that they were speaking, that they were proclaiming. They were actually truth deniers. They were total skeptics of Jesus and who he said he was. They knew the stories about him. They had probably witnessed many of them with their own eyes. They saw how Jesus served people, how he fed people, how he healed the sick, how he gave sight to the blind, how he even raised the dead. But they apparently thought it was all a trick, that it was a big deception, an incredible lie. For they believed this Jesus of Nazareth was a deceiver. Above all things, he was a deceiver. So when they say he saved others, no doubt those words drip with sarcasm. They didn't think he had saved anybody. Much to the contrary, they felt that he had led many astray and away from God. So they surely don't mean it when they say he saved others. And that's confirmed when they follow that up with this. They say he cannot save himself. As you listen to those words, can you hear the mockery? Can you hear the hatred, the bitter sarcasm? What kind of Savior is this? He can't even save himself. He can't even manage to come down off that cross. If he did, we might believe. Well, I'm here to tell you today that they spoke the truth, but they didn't know it. If he was going to save others, he couldn't save himself. He couldn't come down off that cross if people were really going to believe in him. His enemies actually spoke the gospel truth, but they had no idea they were doing it. And Jesus himself many times pointed this out. One time his disciples were arguing with one another. They were arguing about who was going to be top dog in the coming kingdom that Jesus was ushering in, and they had no idea, of course, what they were talking about when they did that. But Jesus in Matthew chapter 20 says this, and when he says it, it goes right over their heads. They didn't understand it until after he went to the cross. But Jesus said, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. His disciples didn't, and his enemies didn't, but Jesus did. Nothing surprising happened to him from his perspective. He knew that in order to save others, he could not save himself. So he gave himself. He gave his life. He poured it out on the cross as a ransom for many. At his last meal, we call usually the Last Supper, with the disciples the night before the cross, Jesus passed the cup to them. And as he did, he said this in Matthew 26, "This is my blood, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Jesus knew, even if no one else did, that he had to be poured out, that he had to be offered, so others could be forgiven, so others could be saved. He knew. He knew if he was going to save others, he could not save himself. It's one time a mother, she was living in a tenement house in a slum. She went shopping for groceries. And that day she made an awful choice, which sometimes people in those situations are forced to make. She made an awful choice to leave her infant child asleep in her crib, in her house, while she went by herself to the store. While she was in the store, a fire engine raced by. And she wondered, could that be going to my place? So she forgot about the groceries. She ran toward home. And indeed, her building had fire hoses aimed at it. It was burning like a matchbox. She found the fire chief. She rushed up to him and she cried out, "My baby is in there." And he shouted back to her, it would be suicide for anyone to go up there now. It's too late. There was a young fireman that was standing nearby, and he volunteered. He said, "Chief, I have a little baby at home. If my house were on fire, I'd want someone to go up and try to save my baby. I'll go." The young fireman climbed the stairs. He got the baby, tossed her into the rescue net, and just as he did that, the house collapsed and he was burned to death. Flash forward 20 years. The scene is a graveside. There's a 20-year-old woman standing there, crying softly. Before her, at the head of this grave, is a statue, the statue of a fireman. A man stopped by and asked very respectfully, "Was that your father?" She says, "No." He says, "Was that your brother?" "No," she says. "That's the man who died for me." This morning, as I stand at the cross, I'm thinking, that's the man who died for me. As we came around the table of the Lord today, as a body of believers, we were proclaiming, here is the man who died for us. And the world so often does not understand. Now, just like the people outside of Jerusalem in the first century around the cross did not understand. The world sees us standing at the cross, they don't understand. "Why do you do that?" they ask. "What are you doing here?" they wonder. And they may even laugh or mock or make fun. But what they need to hear us saying is, that's the man who died for me. And he died for you too. People don't understand your choices, your lifestyle, your beliefs? How could you think the way you think in this day and age? Your answer? Because that man died for me. He died for me. Before I close, can I offer you some insight into what makes me tick? That's a scary proposition. Not just me, but any gospel preacher. The great enemy often whispers things to us, we preachers. He whispers to me things like, "Why are you doing this?" No one's listening. No one's responding. You could do something else. You could do something maybe a little less stressful, less frustrating, more money. Why are you doing this? Sometimes I think that's me talking to myself. But I know where it comes from. And so I've learned to answer those despicable words in this way. Why am I doing this? Because that man died for me. And you may well be here today and you have never responded to that man on the cross. He died for you too. And I know that the great enemy of mankind is saying things to you as well. Similar things. He's saying things like, "What are you doing here in this place? What are you doing here? You're not good enough to be here. You could never be a follower of Jesus. Are you kidding? Besides, you have all the time in the world. You could do it next week. You could do it next year. You could do it in 20 years. But not now." I'm just pleading with you today to stand with me and look at the cross and realize that man died for me. And so, whatever he wants from me, that's okay with me.